Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can see, and sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. In 1887 Montana, a towering cowboy named Bear McCrae had been running from his past for longer than he cared to remember. When he found a broken-down cabin with a leaking roof, he did what felt right. He started fixing it. A little girl watched him work from the shadows, her eyes full of hope he hadn't seen in years. What happened next would surprise them both. As Bear mended fence posts and patched walls, the child whispered something that stopped him cold. Her widowed mother needed help, but not the kind you'd expect. This gentle giant was about to discover that sometimes the biggest repairs happen inside the heart. But could a man running from his demons ever truly find peace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow a man whole. Dust devils danced across the prairie grass, and the wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain that might never come. It was late September in 1887, and the land wore the golden-brown coat of autumn, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Eli Bear McCrae sat astride his bay, gelding on a ridge overlooking a small valley, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. At nearly 7 feet tall and built like the oak trees that once dotted his childhood home in Virginia, Bear commanded attention wherever he went. His hands, large as dinner plates and scarred from years of hard work, rested gently on his saddle horn. Those same hands had once held a rifle in service to the Union Army, had built barns and homes across 3 territories, and had buried more dreams than any man should have to carry. His weathered face, lined by sun and sorrow, surveyed the valley below with the careful eye of a man who'd learned to read trouble before it found him. A thick beard, more grey than brown now at 42, covered a jaw set in the permanent resolve of someone who'd seen too much of the world's harsh truths. But his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held a gentleness that contradicted his intimidating size. The leather saddlebags hanging from his horse contained everything he owned: a spare shirt, basic tools, ammunition, and tucked away in the deepest pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, a faded photograph he hadn't looked at in 3 years. Bear's worn leather gloves, soft from years of use, told the story of countless repairs, countless jobs taken and left behind as he drifted from town to town like tumbleweeds across the plain. 23 years had passed since Appomattox, but some wars never truly ended. The nightmares came less frequently now, but they still came, dreams of cannon smoke and boys too young to die calling for their mothers. Bear had survived when better men hadn't, and that knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders like a pack he could never set down. In the valley below, a small cabin sat crooked and sad against the landscape. Even from this distance, Bear could see the gaps in the roof where shingles had blown away, the sagging porch that spoke of neglect, and the broken fence posts that dotted the property like broken teeth. Smoke rose thin and uncertain from the chimney, suggesting someone was home but struggling to keep the fire going. Bear touched his heels to his horse's flanks and descended the ridge. He'd been riding for weeks without a particular destination, following the old cattle trails that crisscrossed the territory. Work was scarce as winter approached, and most ranchers had already hired their seasonal help. But something about this forgotten homestead called to him, perhaps the way it seemed to lean into the wind like it was barely holding on. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. The cabin was solidly built. Someone had known their craft, but time and weather had taken their toll. The wooden walls, once probably a warm honey color, had faded to weathered gray. Several fence rails lay scattered in the tall grass, and the gate hung askew on leather hinges that had seen better days. What struck Bear most was the silence. No dogs barked at his approach, no chickens scattered from his path, only the wind through the grass and the soft creak of loose boards somewhere on the property. It was the kind of quiet that spoke of people trying not to be noticed, trying to make do with what little they had. He dismounted at the edge of the property and tied his horse to a sturdy fence post, one of the few still standing straight. The bay gelding, a patient animal accustomed to Bear's wandering ways, lowered his head to crop at the sparse grass. Bear studied the cabin with the practiced eye of someone who understood construction. The foundation stones were good and solid, the walls plumb despite their weathered appearance. The roof, though damaged, had good bones underneath the broken shingles. This wasn't a lost cause, just a home that needed someone who cared enough to give it attention. He moved closer to the cabin, his boots making soft sounds on the packed earth. A child's voice drifted from somewhere inside, singing a half-remembered lullaby in a sweet, clear tone that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The song faltered and stopped, as if the singer had suddenly become aware of his presence. Bear paused near the broken porch steps, uncertain. He'd spent so many years avoiding human connection that approaching strangers felt foreign now. But something about this place, about the careful way someone had tried to keep a garden going despite the failing fence, about the child's voice singing in the growing dusk, made him want to help. From the cabin's single front window, curtains made from flour sacks shifted slightly. Someone was watching him, trying to determine if he posed a threat. Bear understood that kind of caution. He'd lived with it himself for more years than he cared to count. Inside the cabin, Anna Hartwell pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the thin curtain, she could see the biggest man she'd ever laid eyes on, standing in her yard like some giant from the old stories her grandmother used to tell. His horse was well cared for, his clothes clean if worn, and his posture suggested patience rather than aggression. But Anna had learned the hard way that appearances could deceive. At 28, Anna carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of a woman who'd been forced to be strong beyond her years. Her dark hair, usually pinned back in a practical bun, had come loose from the day's work, and strands framed a face that might have been called beautiful if not for the lines of worry etched around her green eyes. Those eyes had seen too much sorrow for someone her age, the death of dreams along with the death of her husband. "Mama." Jessie's voice was barely a whisper. At 7 years old, Anna's daughter had already learned to be quiet when strangers appeared. The frontier was no place for careless trust. "Stay back from the window, sweetheart," Anna murmured, though she continued to watch the giant in their yard. The man and he was enormous. She could see that even from inside stood perfectly still, as if he understood that sudden movements might frighten them. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. Anna's late husband, Thomas, had been a good judge of character, and she'd tried to develop the same instinct in the 2 years since his death. This stranger didn't feel dangerous, but then again, she couldn't afford to be wrong. Not with Jessie depending on her. The man took a step back from the cabin, and Anna realized he was leaving. Something in that simple gesture, the way he respected their space, the careful way he moved despite his size, made her heart beat a little slower. Through the window, she watched him walk to where several fence posts lay scattered in the grass. To her amazement, he knelt down and began examining the broken wood, running his large hands over the grain like he was reading a story written there. Without any ceremony, without asking permission or even announcing his presence, the giant began to work. Anna watched in fascination as he gathered the scattered rails, sorting through them to find pieces that could still be used. His movements were economical and sure, the actions of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands. When he found the post-hole digger leaning against the barn, he hefted it like it weighed nothing and began to dig. "Mama, what's he doing?" Jessie pressed her face to the window beside her mother. "I don't rightly know, sweetheart." But Anna did know, or at least she was beginning to understand. The stranger was fixing their fence. Without being asked, without any promise of payment, without even introducing himself, he was repairing what was broken. The light was fading fast, but the man worked steadily, his massive silhouette moving with surprising grace across their property. When full darkness finally forced him to stop, he'd managed to reset 3 posts and restore a section of fence that had been down since the spring storms. Anna heard him moving around outside, the soft sounds of someone settling in for the night. Through the window, she could see the small glow of a carefully banked fire near the barn. He was camping on their property, planning to continue his work in the morning. "Mama," Jessie tugged at her skirt, "why is the big man fixing our fence?" Anna looked down at her daughter's upturned face, so trusting and hopeful, despite everything they'd been through. "I don't know, baby girl. I truly don't know." But as she tucked Jessie into the narrow bed, they shared and listened to the wind test the newly repaired fence posts. Anna found herself hoping the giant would still be there when the sun rose. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was taking care of things that needed fixing. Outside, Bear McCrae pulled his bedroll closer to the dying fire and stared up at the vast Montana sky. The work felt good in his hands, honest and necessary. He'd forgotten how satisfying it could be to build something instead of just passing through. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd start on that roof. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Montana territory, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Bear McCrae had been awake for an hour, watching the sunrise and listening to the sounds of the homestead coming to life. Smoke was already rising from the cabin's chimney, and he could hear the soft murmur of voices inside a woman's gentle tones and a child's higher pitch. He'd banked his small fire and was examining the damaged roof when he heard the cabin door creak open. Bear didn't turn around immediately, understanding instinctively that sudden movements might send whoever was watching him scurrying back inside. Instead, he continued his careful inspection of the shingles, noting which ones could be salvaged and which would need replacing. "Good morning," he called out softly, his deep voice carrying easily in the still air. Silence stretched for a long moment, then barely above a whisper came a child's voice. "Good morning, mister." Bear smiled to himself and slowly turned around. A little girl stood on the cabin's front porch, one small hand gripping the doorframe as if ready to dart back inside at the first sign of trouble. She had dark hair braided with careful precision and wore a dress that had been mended more than once but was scrupulously clean. Her eyes, wide and curious, watched him with the intensity of someone much older. "I'm Bear," he said, settling his large frame down onto the porch steps to make himself less imposing. "What might your name be?" The child considered this for a moment, tilting her head like a curious sparrow. "Jessie," she said finally. "Jessie Hartwell." "That's a fine name," Bear said gravely. "I hope you don't mind me working on your fence yesterday. It looked like it could use some attention." Jessie stepped down from the porch, her natural curiosity beginning to overcome her caution. "Mama says you've been out here all night. Aren't you cold?" "Not too cold," Bear assured her. "I've slept under worse skies than this one." "Are you a cowboy?" Jessie asked, moving closer. "You're awful big for a cowboy." Bear chuckled, a sound that rumbled up from deep in his chest. "I suppose I am bigger than most. Been told I take after my grandfather, he was a big man too." From somewhere inside the cabin came the clatter of cookware and the smell of bacon beginning to sizzle. Bear's stomach reminded him that he'd eaten nothing but hardtack and jerky for the past 2 days, but he pushed the thought aside. He hadn't come here looking for charity. "What happened to your papa, if you don't mind my asking?" Bear said gently. Jessie's face grew solemn, and she kicked at a small stone with the toe of her boot. "He got hurt working. The horses got spooked and the plow." She trailed off, not quite able to finish the story. Bear felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition of loss that never quite faded, no matter how many years passed. "I'm sorry, little one. That must have been very hard for you and your mama." "Mama cries sometimes," Jessie confided, moving closer still. "She thinks I don't know, but I hear her at night. She tries to fix everything herself, but The child gestured helplessly at the broken fence, the sagging roof, the general air of neglect that hung over the homestead. "Your mama's doing the best she can," Bear said firmly. "That's what good folks do, they keep trying, even when things get hard." Jesse studied his face with those serious eyes. "Are you going to help us?" The simple question hung in the air between them, weighted with more hope than any child should have to carry. Bear found himself thinking of another little girl, one he'd failed to protect, one whose memory lived in that photograph, tucked deep in his saddlebags. "I'd like to help," he said carefully, "if your mama says it's all right." "She won't," Jessie said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who'd learned to read the adults in her life. "She doesn't like taking help from anybody. She says we have to make our own way." Before Bear could respond, the cabin door opened again, and a woman stepped onto the porch. Bear rose to his feet, automatically removing his hat, as he'd been taught as a boy in Virginia. Anna Hartwell was smaller than he'd expected, though she carried herself with a straight-back dignity that made her seem taller. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, and her green eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned. She wore a simple brown dress that had been carefully mended, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked hard for everything she had. "Jessie, come inside," Anna said, her voice calm but firm. "But Mama, inside, now." Jessie cast one longing look at Bear before reluctantly obeying, though she stopped just inside the doorway where she could still listen. Anna descended the porch steps slowly, and Bear could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself ready to retreat if necessary. When she spoke, her voice was polite but distant. "I appreciate what you did yesterday with the fence, Mr. McCrae. But most folks call me Bear, Mr. McCrae. But I'm afraid I can't pay you for your work." Bear nodded, having expected this. "Didn't ask for payment, Ma'am. Sometimes a thing just needs doing." Anna's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was trying to puzzle out his angle. In Bear's experience, people who'd been hurt learned to suspect kindness, as if it might be a trap waiting to spring closed. "Nothing's free in this world, Mr. McCrae. What is it you want?" The blunt question hung between them, and Bear found himself respecting her directness even as it stung. He looked around the property at the cabin that needed work, at the broken fence, at the small garden plot where someone had tried to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil. "Your little girl was telling me about her papa," Bear said quietly. "Sounds like he was a good man who worked hard for his family." Pain flickered across Anna's face before she could hide it. "He was. This place has good bones," Bear continued, gesturing toward the cabin. "The foundation's solid, the walls are true. Just needs someone with the time and know-how to set things right." "And you think you're that someone?" Bear met her gaze steadily. "I think I'm someone with time on his hands and nothing pressing to get to. Winter's coming, and you and your daughter are going to need that roof patched before the snows hit." Anna's jaw tightened. "We'll manage. We always have." "I'm sure you will," Bear agreed. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's freely offered." "There's no such thing as freely offered help," Anna shot back. "Men always want something in return, even if they don't say so right away." The bitterness in her voice told Bear everything he needed to know about the kind of help she'd been offered since her husband's death. His hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. "Not all men, ma'am," he said quietly. Anna studied his face for a long moment, and Bear had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than he wanted to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "I can't pay you," she repeated, "and I won't. I won't be beholden to any man, not in any way." "Understood," Bear said, "but the offer stands just the same." Anna turned to go back inside, then paused. "Why?" she asked without looking back. "Why would you help strangers for nothing?" Bear was quiet for so long that Anna finally turned around to face him. When he spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "Because sometimes a man needs to build something instead of just passing through, and because—" He glanced toward the cabin where Jessie's face was pressed against the window, "because every child deserves to feel safe in their own home." Anna followed his gaze to her daughter, and something in her expression softened slightly. When she looked back at Bear, some of the suspicion had faded from her eyes. "The roof," she said finally. "Just the roof. And you sleep in the barn, not outside. Winter nights are getting too cold for camping." Before Bear could respond, she was gone, the cabin door closing firmly behind her. But from the window came a small voice, pitched just loud enough for him to hear. "She's my mom," Jessie whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Please marry her." Bear stood frozen in the yard, Anna's mortified gasp echoing from inside the cabin, while a 7-year-old girl's impossible wish hung in the autumn air like a prayer. The silence that followed Jessie's whispered words stretched like taffy in the crisp morning air. Inside the cabin, Anna's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the thin walls, followed by the rapid patter of feet as she undoubtedly chased her daughter away from the window. Bear stood motionless in the yard, his hat still in his hands, processing what had just happened. In all his years of drifting from place to place, he'd encountered plenty of uncomfortable situations, but nothing quite like this. A child's innocent wish, spoken with such hope and certainty, had just turned his simple offer of help into something far more complicated. From inside the cabin came the muffled sounds of what was clearly a very serious conversation between mother and daughter. Bear couldn't make out the words, but Anna's tone was unmistakably mortified, while Jessie's higher voice carried notes of confusion and protest. Bear settled his hat back on his head and walked to where he'd left his tools by the barn. The best thing he could do right now was give Anna time to collect herself and figure out how to handle her daughter's unexpected matchmaking attempt. He'd learned long ago that rushing into difficult conversations rarely improved anything. As he gathered rope and examined the ladder he'd found leaning against the barn, Bear's mind wandered to the chain Anna wore around her neck. He'd noticed it yesterday when she'd stood on the porch, a thin gold chain that disappeared beneath the collar of her dress. Most likely her wedding ring, he figured. Some widows wore them that way, close to their heart, when the pain was still too fresh to bear on their finger. Thomas Hartwell had been dead for 2 years, according to what Jessie had told him, but grief didn't follow any man's timeline. Bear understood that better than most. Some losses carved themselves so deep into a person's bones that they never quite healed, just learned to ache a little less with time. The cabin door opened with deliberate force, and Anna emerged, looking like a woman who'd had to compose herself quickly. Her cheeks still held a flush of embarrassment, and she avoided meeting Bear's eyes directly. "Mr. McCrae," she began, her voice carefully controlled, "I need to apologize for my daughter's inappropriate comment. She's 7 years old and doesn't understand." "No need to apologize," Bear interrupted gently. "Children say what's in their hearts. Nothing wrong with that." Anna's flush deepened. "She's been asking me about getting married again ever since Mrs. Patterson in town remarried last month. I've tried to explain that not every woman needs a husband, but a little girl who lost her papa might think differently," Bear finished. Anna's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment Bear glimpsed the vulnerability she worked so hard to hide. She remembers how Thomas used to fix things around here, how safe she felt when he was alive. "I think she believes that if I married again, everything would go back to the way it was." Bear nodded, understanding more than Anna probably realized. Hard thing for a child to accept that some changes can't be undone. "She means well," Anna said quickly, as if defending Jessie from criticism. "She's a good girl, just trying to take care of her mama the only way she knows how," Bear said. "Nothing wrong with a child who loves that deep." Anna finally met his eyes, and Bear saw surprise there, as if she hadn't expected him to understand. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sun warming the space between them. "The roof," Anna said finally, seeming to remember why they were both standing in her yard. "You said you could fix it before winter." "Yes, ma'am. Should take me 3, maybe 4 days if the weather holds." Anna nodded, then hesitated. "I don't suppose you'd accept meals in payment." I can't offer much, but I do cook decent enough. Bear considered this carefully. He could see the pride in her, offer a way to give something in return without compromising her independence. That would be most appreciated, Mrs. Hartwell. Been living on trail food for longer than I care to admit. Something loosened in Anna's posture, as if his acceptance of her terms had settled an important matter between them. Breakfast is ready now, if you'd like to wash up. There's a pump around back. As Anna disappeared back into the cabin, Bear made his way to the pump she'd mentioned. The water was cold enough to make him suck in a sharp breath, but it felt good to wash the dust and sweat from his hands and face. He finger-combed his beard and tried to make himself as presentable as possible before heading to the cabin. The inside of the small home was clean and organized, though Bear's trained eye could see where Anna had made do with makeshift repairs. A table leg had been reinforced with splints and rope, curtains had been sewn from flour sacks, and the floorboards near the door had been patched with mismatched wood. Everything spoke of someone determined to keep their home together through sheer force of will. Jessie sat at the small table, swinging her legs and stealing glances at Bear when she thought he wasn't looking. Anna moved efficiently around the tiny kitchen, filling a plate with bacon, eggs, and biscuits that smelled like heaven. "Sit anywhere you'd like," Anna said, though there were only 3 chairs around the table. Bear chose the chair that looked most likely to support his weight and accepted the plate Anna handed him. The food was simple but prepared with care, and after days of hardtack and jerky, it tasted like a feast. "This is wonderful, Mrs. Hartwell, thank you." Anna inclined her head at the compliment, but Bear noticed she barely touched her own food. Jessie, meanwhile, had apparently decided that her earlier comment was forgotten and was chattering about everything and nothing the barn cat, who'd had kittens, the way the morning frost made patterns on the windows, her favorite hiding spot in the old oak tree by the creek. "Papa used to take me fishing at the creek," Jessie said suddenly, her voice growing quieter. "He said I was the best fishing partner he ever had." Anna's hand stilled on her coffee cup, and Bear could see the grief that crossed her face like a shadow. "I bet you were," Bear said gently. "Good fishing partners are hard to find." "Do you know how to fish?" Jessie asked. "Some," Bear admitted. "Learned when I was about your age." "Maybe you could take me sometime," Jessie said hopefully. "Mama doesn't like to go to the creek much anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain. Bear glanced at Anna and saw her fighting to maintain her composure. "Maybe," he said carefully, "if your mama thinks it's all right." Anna pushed back from the table abruptly. "Jessie, why don't you go gather the eggs while Mr. McCrae and I discuss the roof repairs?" It was clearly a dismissal, and Jessie recognized it as such. She slipped down from her chair and headed for the door, but not before giving Bear a meaningful look that seemed to say, "See, she needs someone to take care of her." Once they were alone, Anna busied herself clearing the table, her movements sharp and efficient. "She doesn't mean any harm," Anna said without looking at him. "I know that," Bear replied. "She's trying to fix what she thinks is broken." Anna's hands stilled on the dishes. "Some things can't be fixed, Mr. McCrae. Some things are meant to stay broken." Bear stood up from the table, his massive frame filling the small space. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but roofs can be fixed, and sometimes that's enough to start with." For 3 days, Bear worked on the cabin roof with the methodical patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Each morning, he woke before dawn in the barn, surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and leather, and lay listening to the sounds of the homestead coming to life. Anna was always up early, moving quietly so as not to wake Jessie, and Bear had learned to time his own rising so he could have the pump to himself before the day truly began. The work was satisfying in a way he'd almost forgotten. Each shingle he replaced, each board he secured, felt like he was building something permanent instead of just passing through. His hands, scarred from years of labor and war, seemed to remember skills he'd learned as a young man helping his father repair their farmhouse back in Virginia. But the nights were becoming difficult. On the 3rd night, Bear woke gasping from dreams that had been mercifully absent for months. In the dream, he stood in a burning farmhouse, calling for his wife Sarah and their daughter Emma, but the smoke was too thick and the flames too hot. He reached the room where they should have been, only to find empty beds and the sound of coughing that grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely. Bear sat up in his bedroll, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat cooled on his skin despite the autumn chill, and his hands shook as he reached for the flask of whiskey he kept for nights like this. He took a small sip, just enough to quiet the echoes in his mind, and forced himself to breathe slowly until the panic subsided. Through the barn's single window, he could see the cabin dark and peaceful. Anna and Jesse were safe inside, unaware that 20 feet away, a man was fighting battles that had ended over 2 decades ago. Bear pulled on his boots and stepped outside, needing air that didn't smell like hay and old wood. The night sky stretched endlessly overhead, stars scattered like scattered grain across black earth. He'd always found comfort in that vastness. It made his problems seem smaller, more manageable. He was surprised to see a faint glow coming from the cabin's kitchen window. Someone was awake. Moving as quietly as his large frame allowed, Bear approached the cabin. Through the window, he could see Anna sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of what looked like tea steaming before her. She wasn't drinking it, just holding the cup in both hands, as if drawing warmth from it. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the lamplight, she looked younger and more vulnerable than she allowed herself to appear during the day. Bear started to turn away, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a private moment, when Anna looked up and met his eyes through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Anna rose and moved to the door. "Can't sleep either?" she asked quietly when she opened it. "Didn't mean to disturb you," Bear said. "Just needed some air." Anna studied his face in the moonlight, and Bear wondered what she saw there. Bad dreams? The question was asked so matter-of-factly that Bear found himself nodding before he could think better of it. "Come in," Anna said, stepping aside. "No point in both of us losing sleep alone." The kitchen was warm and welcoming, a sharp contrast to the cold night air. Anna poured a second cup of tea and set it across from her own place at the table. "Chamomile," she said. "Helps sometimes." Bear accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his large hands around the warm ceramic. The tea was mild and soothing, with a hint of honey. "Your family?" Anna asked, after a few minutes of comfortable silence. Bear nodded, not trusting his voice. "How long?" 23 years this December." The words came out rough and quiet. Anna absorbed this information without comment, sipping her tea and giving him space to say more if he wanted to. "Influenza outbreak," Bear found himself saying. "I was away, working on a railroad crew down in Tennessee. By the time I got the message and made it home." He stopped, unable to finish the familiar story. "I'm sorry," Anna said simply. They sat in silence for a while. Two people who understood loss in ways they wouldn't wish on anyone else. Finally, Anna spoke again. "Thomas died in the spring, during planting season. The horses spooked at something, maybe a snake. We never knew for sure. The plow caught him and—" She shrugged, a gesture that tried to minimize the enormity of what she was describing. "Jessie found him. She still has nightmares sometimes." Bear felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's a heavy burden for a little girl. "She blames herself," Anna continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thinks if she'd been helping instead of playing by the creek, she might have seen what spooked the horses. Children always think they could have changed things," Bear said. "I spent years believing if I'd just come home a day earlier, a week earlier. But you know better now." Bear considered the question carefully. "I know it wouldn't have mattered. The influenza took half the county that winter. Being there wouldn't have saved them, would have just meant I died too." Anna nodded slowly. "Knowing something and believing it are different things." "Yes, they are." They finished their tea in silence, each lost in memories that were too painful to share, but somehow easier to bear in the presence of someone who understood. When Anna finally stood to rinse the cups, Bear rose as well. "Thank you," he said, "for the tea, for this." Anna paused at the sink, her back to him. "Sometimes the nights are the hardest part." "Yes, Mum, they are." Bear was almost to the door when Anna spoke again. "The medal," she said quietly, "the one in your saddlebag, wrapped in oiled cloth." "What's it for?" Bear froze, his hand on the door handle. He'd been careful with his belongings, certain that Anna had never been near his gear. "Jessie mentioned seeing something shiny when she was playing near the barn yesterday," Anna explained. "She's curious about everything, and I'm afraid she might have peeked. I told her to leave your things alone." "It's all right," Bear said, though his voice had gone tight. "You don't have to tell me." Bear stood with his back to her for a long moment, wrestling with words he'd never spoken aloud. "Congressional Medal of Honor," he said finally, "for actions during the siege of Vicksburg." The silence behind him stretched so long that Bear finally turned around. Anna was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You're a war hero," she said. "I'm a man who survived when better men didn't," Bear corrected. "The medal doesn't change that." Anna moved closer, and Bear could see something shifting in her expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Is that why you help people? Why you're here fixing our roof for nothing?" Bear considered the question. "Maybe, or maybe I just got tired of running from ghosts." Anna reached out as if to touch his arm, then caught herself and pulled her hand back. "The ghosts never really go away, do they?" "No," Bear said quietly, "but sometimes you find people who help you carry them." This time, when Anna reached out, she didn't pull back. Her hand rested briefly on his forearm, warm and reassuring. "Good night, Bear," she said softly. "Good night, Anna." It wasn't until he was back in the barn, settling into his bedroll, that Bear realized it was the first time she'd used his given name. By the end of the first week, Bear had finished the roof and moved on to other repairs around the homestead. He worked with quiet efficiency, fixing loose boards on the porch, reinforcing the chicken coop, and clearing years of debris from the rain gutters. Each task he completed seemed to reveal two more that needed attention, but Bear found he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond simply surviving until the next day. Anna had gradually relaxed her vigilance around him, though she still maintained a careful distance. She no longer watched him through the curtains when he worked, and their conversations during meals had grown easier, more natural. She even smiled occasionally at something Jessie said, and Bear treasured those moments like small gifts. Jessie, meanwhile, had appointed herself as Bear's unofficial assistant. She followed him around the property with endless questions and a willingness to help that far exceeded her small hand's ability to actually assist. Bear found her chatter soothing, a bright counterpoint to the silence that had marked most of his recent years. "Why don't you have a family?" Jessie asked one afternoon, as Bear repaired a section of fence near the garden plot. Bear paused in his work, considering how to answer such a direct question from a 7-year-old. "I did have a family once," he said carefully, "but they died when I was away working." Jessie absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often showed toward life's harder truths. "That's sad," she said simply. "Were they nice?" "Very nice," Bear said, his throat tightening slightly. "My wife Sarah made the best apple pie in 3 counties, and my little girl Emma loved to hear stories before bedtime." "What kind of stories?" Bear found himself smiling at the memory. "Adventure stories, mostly. About brave princesses and clever animals and faraway places." "I like stories too," Jessie said hopefully. "Mama used to tell them, but she's been too tired lately." Bear glanced toward the cabin, where Anna was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. Even from a distance, he could see the weariness in her movements, the way she paused to rest between each task. "Maybe I could tell you a story sometime," Bear offered. "If your mama says it's all right." Jessie's face lit up. "Really? Tonight? We'll see." That evening, after supper, Jessie approached the subject with the strategic planning of a seasoned negotiator. "Mama," she said innocently, "Bear knows stories about princesses and animals." Anna looked up from her mending, raising an eyebrow at her daughter's transparent maneuvering. "Does he now? He told me so. And I was thinking, since I've been very good about gathering eggs and helping with the washing." Jessie let the sentence hang, clearly hoping her mother would fill in the blank. Bear watched this exchange with amusement, impressed by the child's tactical approach. Anna, for her part, seemed to be fighting a smile. "Mr. McCrae has been working hard all day," Anna said. "I'm sure he's tired." "Not too tired for a story," Bear said gently, "if you don't mind." Anna studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "One story, then bed." Jessie clapped her hands together in delight and immediately settled herself on the floor near Bear's chair. Anna returned to her mending, but Bear noticed she was listening as intently as her daughter. "Once upon a time," Bear began, "in a kingdom far from here, there lived a princess who was the bravest person in all the land." The story that emerged was one Bear remembered telling Emma years ago, about a princess who saved her kingdom not through magic or beauty, but through kindness and cleverness. As he spoke, he found himself watching Anna's face in the lamplight, noting the way her expression softened as she listened. When the story ended, Jessie sighed contentedly. That was a good story. The princess was smart. "Yes, she was," Bear agreed. "Sometimes being smart is more important than being strong." After Jessie had been tucked into bed, Anna returned to the kitchen, where Bear was preparing to take his leave. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the story. She hasn't looked that happy in a long time." "She's a good child," Bear replied. "You've raised her well." Anna's expression grew complicated. "Some days I wonder if I'm enough, if I can give her everything she needs." "You're giving her the most important thing, love. The rest," Bear gestured around the small cabin, "the rest can be figured out." Anna was quiet for a moment, then surprised him by asking, "Would you like some coffee? I know you usually head out to the barn about now, but if you're not tired." Bear accepted the offer gratefully, settling back into his chair while Anna prepared the coffee. The domestic routine felt strange and comfortable at the same time, like putting on clothes that had once fit perfectly but had been stored away for too long. "The farming tools in the barn," Bear said carefully. "Some of them could be repaired." Anna's posture stiffened slightly. "I've managed to keep the garden going." "I know you have, but with winter coming and spring planting to think about." Bear let the sentence trail off, not wanting to push too hard. "I can't afford to hire help for planting season," Anna said bluntly. "Wasn't suggesting you hire anyone," Bear replied. "Just that some of those tools might work better with a little attention." Anna poured coffee for both of them, her movements careful and controlled. "You're planning to stay through spring?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to address directly. "Haven't made any plans beyond getting your place ready for winter," Bear said honestly, "but I've got nowhere pressing to be." Anna nodded slowly, as if processing this information. "The tools belong to Thomas. I haven't been able to bring myself to." She stopped, shaking her head. "It's all right," Bear said gently. "Grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline. Sometimes I think Jessie needs to see me moving forward, making plans for the future. But other times," Anna's voice grew quiet, "other times I feel like if I change too much, I'll lose what little I have left of him." Bear understood that sentiment better than he could express. "Fixing tools doesn't mean forgetting the man who used them," he said. "Sometimes it means honoring his memory by keeping his work alive." Anna looked up at him, and Bear saw a flicker of something that might have been hope. "You really think the farm could work again?" "I think any place that means this much to someone is worth fighting for," Bear said. "Question is whether you want to fight for it." Anna was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Bear nodded, recognizing the significance of that small concession. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Winter was approaching fast, and decisions would need to be made soon about what came next. But for now, it was enough to sit in the warm kitchen, drinking coffee with a woman who was slowly learning to trust again, while her daughter slept safely in the next room. The first snow arrived earlier than expected, dusting the Montana territory in a thin layer of white that made everything look clean and new. Bear woke in the barn to the unusual quiet that snow brought, the way it muffled sounds and softened the harsh edges of the world. Over the past 2 weeks, something had shifted between him and Anna. The change was subtle, longer conversations over meals, the way she sometimes forgot to maintain her careful distance when they worked side by side, the small smile that appeared when she thought he wasn't looking. Bear found himself looking forward to these moments with an anticipation that both warmed and worried him. Anna had agreed to let him repair Thomas's farming tools, a decision that had clearly cost her emotionally, but which she'd made with quiet determination. They now spent their evenings in the barn together, Anna holding the lantern while Bear worked to restore plows and harrows that had sat unused for 2 growing seasons. "This one's in better shape than I expected," Bear said, running his hands along the blade of a cultivator. "Your husband took good care of his equipment." Anna's face softened at the mention of Thomas. "He said tools were like partners, treat them well, and they'd never let you down." "Smart man," Bear said, meaning it. "This cultivator will serve you well come spring, once I get the rust off and oil the joints." Anna moved closer, holding the lantern higher so Bear could see his work better. In the golden glow, her face looked younger, less burdened by the weight she carried during daylight hours. "I've been thinking about what you said," Anna said quietly, "about fighting for this place." Bear continued working, giving her space to say what was on her mind without feeling pressured. "Thomas had plans," Anna continued. "He wanted to expand the garden, maybe try some new crops that would grow well in this climate. He thought we could make a real go of it here, build something lasting for Jesse." "Those sound like good plans," Bear said. "They were, but after he died, Anna trailed off, setting the lantern down on a nearby crate. "I couldn't see past getting through each day. The idea of planning for next year or the year after that, it felt impossible." Bear straightened up from his work, giving Anna his full attention. "And now," Anna pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the barn was reasonably warm. "Now I think maybe Jesse deserves a mother who believes in tomorrow." The words hung between them, heavy with significance. Bear could hear the courage it had taken for Anna to say them, the way she was choosing hope over the safer certainty of despair. "She does," Bear said gently, "and you deserve a future worth believing in too." Anna looked up at him, and Bear saw something vulnerable and afraid in her eyes. "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I try and fail and lose what little we have left?" "Then you'll try again," Bear said simply. "That's what strong people do, they get back up." "Is that what you did after you lost your family?" Bear considered the question carefully. "No," he said honestly. "I ran, spent 23 years running from anything that might matter to me again." "What changed?" Bear looked around the barn, at the tools he was restoring, at the woman who was slowly learning to trust him with more than just repairs to her property. "Maybe I got tired of running," he said, "or maybe I found something worth staying for." The intensity of his gaze made Anna flush and look away, but she didn't step back. Instead, she surprised him by moving closer. "Bear," she said softly, "I need you to know that I can't. That is, I'm not ready to—" "I know," Bear interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, but you're staying through the winter? If you'll have me." Anna nodded, and Bear could see relief in her expression. "Good. That's good." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. Outside, the wind was picking up, and Bear could hear the first fat snowflakes beginning to tap against the roof. "There's something else," Anna said suddenly, her voice carrying a nervous edge. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned that the church is having a harvest dance next Saturday. She thought that is," she suggested, "that we should go?" Bear finished. Anna nodded, her cheeks pink with embarrassment. "I told her it was ridiculous, that I wasn't ready for such things, but she said it would be good for Jessie to see other children and that I needed to start participating in community events again." Bear could imagine the conversation, could picture the well-meaning pressure from neighbors who thought they knew what was best for the young widow. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I don't know," Anna admitted. "Part of me thinks it's too soon, that people will talk, but another part—" She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Another part thinks maybe it's time to stop hiding." "Then we'll go," Bear said decisively. Anna's eyes widened. "You don't mind? Being seen with Jessie and me? I mean, people will assume—" "Let them assume what they want," Bear said firmly. "Won't be the first time folks have talked about me, and I doubt it'll be the last." Anna smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "Jessie will be so excited. She loves dancing, though she hasn't had much opportunity lately." "I should probably warn you," Bear said, returning to his work on the cultivator. "I'm not much of a dancer, likely to step on your feet more than not." "I think I can manage," Anna said, and there was something in her voice that made Bear look up. She was watching him with an expression he'd never seen before, warm and considering, as if she was seeing him in a new light. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. "Anna," Bear said quietly. "Yes?" Before he could say what was on his mind, the barn door burst open and Jessie tumbled in, shaking snow from her coat and chattering excitedly about the storm. "Mama, Bear, it's snowing so hard I can barely see the cabin from the porch. Do you think it'll stick? Do you think we'll be snowed in?" Anna stepped back from Bear, the spell broken, but when she looked at him, there was something new in her expression. A promise, perhaps, or at least the beginning of one. "I hope not, sweetheart," Anna said, ruffling Jessie's hair, "but if we are, at least we'll be warm and well-fed." Bear watched the interaction between mother and daughter, noting the way Anna's hand lingered on Jessie's head, the protective tenderness in her gesture. In Anna's mother's Bible, which he'd glimpsed on the kitchen table, pressed flowers from her wedding day, still marked the pages about love and new beginnings. Perhaps, Bear thought, some things were worth the risk of hoping for. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white and making everything look possible again. The harvest dance had been everything Jessie hoped for, and more. Bear had indeed stepped on Anna's feet during their one careful waltz, but she'd laughed instead of complaining, and the sound had been worth any amount of embarrassment. The entire community had welcomed them as a family unit, and for one evening, Bear had allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to truly belong somewhere again. But 3 days later, as he worked to reinforce the cabin's foundation against the coming winter freeze, Bear's shovel struck something that definitely wasn't rock or root. He'd been digging along the east wall, where Anna had mentioned problems with water seepage during heavy rains. The ground was harder than expected, filled with an unusual amount of broken stone and debris. When his shovel clanged against something metallic, Bear assumed he'd hit an old horseshoe or piece of discarded farm equipment. Instead, he found himself looking at the corner of what appeared to be an oiled leather pouch, wrapped tight and buried about 3 feet down. Bear carefully excavated around it, his curiosity growing as the package revealed itself to be deliberately hidden rather than simply lost. The leather was good quality, the kind used for important documents that needed protection from moisture and time. Inside the main compartment, Bear found a survey map of the property and surrounding area, dated 5 years earlier. Red marks and notations covered the paper in what looked like surveyor's handwriting, but it was the smaller packet inside that made Bear's blood run cold. assay reports, geological surveys, and correspondence from the Montana Territory Mining Commission that made it clear why someone had gone to great lengths to hide these documents. Anna's land, this struggling homestead that barely produced enough vegetables to see them through winter, sat directly on top of what the reports estimated to be one of the richest silver deposits ever discovered in the Montana Territory. Bear sat back on his heels, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. The property that Anna was struggling to keep, that she feared losing to debt and failed crops, was potentially worth more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. But if the reports were accurate, and if the wrong people found out about this discovery, Anna and Jesse would be in more danger than they could possibly imagine. Bear's hands shook slightly as he read through the correspondence. The letters were addressed to Thomas Hartwell, and it became clear that Anna's late husband had been approached by mining interests in the months before his death. Thomas had apparently refused all offers to sell, wanting to keep the land for farming and his family's future. One letter in particular made Bear's stomach twist with dread. It was from a company called Steel Mining Consortium, and the tone grew increasingly aggressive as the correspondence continued. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's fatal accident, contained language that could only be described as threats. "Mr. Hartwell," the letter read, "your continued refusal to consider our generous offers forces us to explore other avenues for securing the mineral rights we require. We trust you will reconsider your position before circumstances beyond our control make such reconsideration impossible." It was signed by Morton Steele himself. Bear carefully rewrapped the documents in their oiled leather and buried them again, his mind racing. Thomas Hartwell's death might not have been the simple farming accident everyone believed it to be. And if Morton Steele was willing to use threats against a man defending his family's land, what might he do to a widow and child who stood in his way? As if summoned by Bear's thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats carried across the valley. Bear looked up to see a group of riders approaching the homestead, 5 men on good horses, moving with the purposeful confidence of people who expected to get their way. Bear recognized the lead rider immediately from his description around town. Morton Steele was a small, sharp-featured man who compensated for his lack of physical presence with expensive clothes and an air of barely contained aggression. The men with him had the look of hired muscle, the kind of people who solved problems with their fists when words failed. Bear rose slowly from his work, positioning himself between the approaching riders and the cabin where Anna and Jesse were preparing lunch. His hands, he noticed, had automatically shifted into the relaxed but ready posture he'd learned during his military years. "You must be the drifter I've been hearing about," Steele called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet from where Bear stood. "McCrae, isn't it?" "That's right," Bear replied evenly. "And you'd be Morton Steele." Steele's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting he was accustomed to being treated with more deference. "My reputation precedes me, I see. Good. That will make this conversation easier." "What conversation would that be?" Steele dismounted with the fluid motion of someone who'd grown up on horseback. His men remained mounted, a subtle display of intimidation that wasn't lost on Bear. "The conversation about your future employment prospects," Steele said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm always looking for capable men, and I hear you've got useful skills." "I'm employed," Bear said simply, "by a widow who can barely afford to feed herself." Steele laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Come now, McCrae, we both know that's charity work, not employment. I'm talking about real money." Behind Steele, his men shifted in their saddles, hands resting casually near their weapons. Bear noted their positions automatically, calculating angles and distances with the instincts of someone who'd survived more than his share of dangerous situations. "What I do with my time is my business," Bear said. "What brings you to Mrs. Hartwell's property?" Steele's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Hartwell and I have business to discuss. Private business. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step aside." "I'm afraid I can't do that." The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the two men stared at each other. Bear could feel the attention of Steele's men focusing on him, could sense the subtle shift in their posture that suggested they were preparing for trouble. "You're making a mistake, McCrae," Steele said quietly. "A very expensive mistake. Wouldn't be the first time." Before Steele could respond, the cabin door opened and Anna stepped onto the porch. She took in the scene at a glance, Bear standing protectively in the yard, 5 armed men on horseback, and Morton Steele with his predatory smile. "Mr. Steele," Anna said, her voice carefully controlled, "I told you before, I'm not interested in selling." "Circumstances change, Mrs. Hartwell," Steele replied, not taking his eyes off Bear. "I'm prepared to be very generous with my final offer." "Final offer?" Anna moved closer, and Bear could see the fear she was trying to hide. "That sounds like a threat." "Not a threat," Steele said smoothly, "simply a recognition of reality. Winter is coming, you have debts mounting, and your hired hand won't be able to stay forever. Sometimes the smart thing is to take what's offered while it's still being offered." Bear felt something cold and dangerous settling in his chest. The casual way Steele spoke about Anna's vulnerability, the implicit threat in his words about Bear not staying forever, the presence of armed men backing up what was supposed to be a business conversation. It all painted a clear picture of the kind of man they were dealing with. "How much do you know about Mrs. Hartwell's financial situation?" Bear asked quietly. Steele's smile widened. "I make it my business to know these things. Knowledge is power, McCrae, and power is what separates those who succeed from those who don't." Anna's face had gone pale, and Bear realized she was beginning to understand that this wasn't a simple business dispute. This was something much more dangerous. "Jessie," Anna called toward the cabin, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Stay inside, sweetheart." "Smart woman," Steele observed. "Children should be protected from adult conversations." The threat in his words was barely veiled now, and Bear saw Anna's hands tremble before she clenched them into fists. "You need to leave," Bear said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made Steele's men shift nervously in their saddles. "Or what?" Steele challenged. "You'll throw us off the property? You and what army?" Bear smiled then, and something in his expression made even Steele take a step backward. "I won't need an army," Bear said softly, "but I should probably mention that I've got friends at the Territorial Marshal's office. Might be interested to hear about mining companies that use intimidation tactics on widows and children." Steele's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, one of his men leaned down and whispered something urgent in his ear. Whatever was said made Steele's expression change to something that looked almost like fear. "This isn't over," Steele said, remounting his horse with quick, angry movements. "Mrs. Hartwell, I strongly suggest you reconsider my offer, for everyone's sake." As the riders disappeared back down the valley, Bear turned to find Anna staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "How did they know about our debts?" she asked quietly. "And why did that man look at you like he was afraid?" Bear realized that the moment of truth had arrived much sooner than he'd expected. The documents buried beside the cabin contained secrets that could protect Anna and Jessie or get them all killed if the wrong people found out. But first, he had to figure out how to tell Anna that everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change. The evening after Morton Steele's visit, Bear sat at Anna's kitchen table with the recovered documents spread before them. Anna stared at the papers as if they might disappear if she looked away, while Jessie played quietly in the corner with her hand-carved wooden horse, unaware that her world was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. "Silver," Anna said for the third time, her voice hollow with disbelief. "There's silver under our land. According to these assay reports, enough silver to make you one of the wealthiest women in the Montana Territory," Bear confirmed. "Maybe in the entire West." Anna picked up one of the geological surveys, studying the red marks and notations that meant nothing to her but everything to men like Morton Steele. Thomas knew about this? Appears so. These letters show Steele's company was pressuring him to sell for months before his death. Anna's face went white as the implications hit her. You think Thomas's accident wasn't an accident? Bear chose his words carefully. I think a man who threatens people in writing is capable of more than just threats. The silence that followed was heavy with fear and realization. Anna rose from the table and moved to the window, looking out at the land that had been both her burden and her salvation. What do we do? She asked quietly. First, we make sure you and Jesse are safe, Bear said. Then we figure out the best way to protect your claim and your rights. Anna turned back to him, and Bear could see the steel beneath her fear. Our rights. You found these documents, Bear. That makes you part of this. Anna. No, she interrupted firmly. You could have kept this discovery to yourself. Could have taken those papers and disappeared in the night, made your own deal with Steele or his competitors. But you didn't. You brought them to me. Bear stood up from the table, his massive frame filling the small kitchen. I didn't come here looking for silver, Anna. I came here because a little girl needed someone to fix her roof. And now. Bear looked at Jesse, still playing innocently in the corner, then back at Anna. Now I stay because that little girl and her mother need someone to help them fight for what's theirs. Anna's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. It won't be easy. Men like Steele don't give up when this much money is involved. No, they don't, Bear agreed, which is why we need help. Over the next 2 days, Bear made careful trips into town, using his reputation as a war hero to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. He spoke with the territorial marshal, the land registry office, and the local banker, building a network of allies who could help protect Anna's claim. The responses were mixed. Marshal Davies was sympathetic but realistic about his limitations. Territorial law enforcement was spread thin, and mining disputes often turned violent. The land registry confirmed that Anna's deed was solid, but warned that paperwork could be challenged or mysteriously lost if the right pressure was applied. The banker, Mr. Hutchinson, was more encouraging, offering to help Anna secure legal representation and suggesting that the discovery might actually solve her debt problems. But it was Pastor Williams who provided the most valuable insight. Morton Steele's been buying up land all through this valley, the preacher told Bear during a private conversation in the church office. Folks who refuse to sell have had a run of bad luck, barn fires, livestock poisoning, equipment sabotage. Nothing that can be proved, mind you, but the pattern's there for those who care to see it. What about the law? Bear asked. Pastor Williams shook his head sadly. Steele's got connections in the territorial capital. Money talks, and he's got plenty of it. Local marshals can only do so much when the corruption reaches that high. Bear felt his father's pocket watch ticking steadily in his vest, marking time that was running out faster than he'd hoped. The pieces were falling into place, but not in ways that favored Anna and Jesse. That evening, Bear found Anna sitting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in her heavy shawl and staring out at the valley. He settled beside her, and they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. I've been thinking about what you said, Anna finally spoke, about fighting for what's ours. And Thomas always said this land would be Jesse's inheritance, her future. Anna's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I won't let men like Steele steal that from her. Bear nodded, unsurprised by her decision, but proud of the courage it represented. It's going to be dangerous, Anna. Once we make our claim official, once the territory knows what's under this land, there'll be no going back. I know. Anna turned to look at him, and Bear saw no fear in her expression, only determination. But running away won't keep us safe either. Steele will keep coming until he gets what he wants. Then we make our stand here. Anna reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold but steady. Together, Bear confirmed. Inside the cabin, they found Jessie at the kitchen table, carefully drawing pictures with the pencil and paper Anna had bought her in town. Her current creation showed three figures standing in front of a cabin, a very tall man, a woman, and a small girl with braids. "That's us," Jessie announced proudly. "Our family." Anna and Bear exchanged a look over the child's head, both struck by the simple truth in those words. Somehow, without any of them quite realizing when it had happened, they had become a family. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Anna said, kneeling beside her daughter's chair. "I'm going to make more pictures," Jessie declared. "One for each room in our house, so everyone knows we belong here." After Jessie had been tucked into bed, Anna and Bear returned to the kitchen to finalize their plans. Bear spread a hand-drawn map of the property on the table, marking strategic positions and potential escape routes. "If Steele comes with more men," Bear said, "we'll need to be ready. The cabin's solid, but it won't hold against determined attackers." "You think it will come to that?" "I think Steele's already shown he's willing to use intimidation and threats when those don't work." Bear let the sentence trail off, but Anna understood. "What about going to the territorial authorities, making the claim official before Steele can stop us?" Bear had considered this option extensively. "It's our best long-term strategy, but it's also the most dangerous short-term move. Once those papers are filed, Steele will know we found Thomas's documents. He'll have to act fast before word spreads and other mining interests get involved." Anna absorbed this information, her face grave. "So we'll be forcing a confrontation." "Yes, but on our terms, with our preparations, rather than letting Steele choose the time and place." Anna nodded slowly. "When do we file the claim?" Bear pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, noting the steady tick that had marked time through his childhood, his war years, and all the lonely decades since. "Tomorrow morning, I'll ride to the territorial office in Helena, file all the paperwork, and make sure copies go to every relevant authority. Meanwhile, you and Jessie will stay with Pastor Williams and his wife." "No," Anna interrupted firmly. "If we're making our stand, we make it here, together." "Anna, it's too dangerous. This is our home, Bear. Our land. I won't be driven away from it." Bear studied her face, seeing the same stubborn determination that had kept her going through 2 years of hardship and loss. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. We get help from the neighbors, set up defensive positions, and make sure everyone understands what they're signing up for." "What about the silver itself? The actual mining?" Bear smiled grimly. "That's the beautiful part. According to these reports, the silver deposit is extensive enough to support multiple operations. Even if Steele gets part of it, there'll be plenty left for you and Jessie. But first, we have to live long enough to see that future." Anna reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I need you to know something, Bear. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes next, you've given us more than just help with repairs. You've given us hope." Bear turned his hand over to clasp hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of her hard work and the warmth that spoke of her generous heart. "You've given me something too, Anna, something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "A reason to stop running." They sat holding hands across the kitchen table, surrounded by maps and legal documents and plans for a future that might not survive the next day. Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a hard winter. But inside the cabin, 3 people who had found each other against all odds were preparing to fight for the right to stay together. And sometimes, Bear reflected, that was all the hope anyone needed. Tomorrow would bring Morton Steele and whatever forces he could muster. But tonight, they were a family, and they were home. Dawn came grey and cold, with the kind of wind that cut through a man's coat and chilled him to the bone. Bear had been awake since before sunrise, moving quietly around the property and checking the defensive preparations they'd made the night before. The neighboring ranchers, 3 good men who understood the value of standing together against outside threats, had arrived just after midnight and taken their positions. Bear's modified hammer hung from his belt, weighted for both construction and protection, its familiar weight a comfort against his hip. The tool that had built so much of their happiness might soon be called upon to defend it. From the kitchen window, Anna watched Morton Steele's riders crest the ridge that overlooked their valley. Even at this distance, she could count at least 8 men, all armed and moving with the purposeful confidence of people who expected resistance. "Mama?" Jessie's voice was small and frightened. Despite their efforts to keep her unaware of the danger, children had a way of sensing when the adults around them were afraid. "It's going to be all right, sweetheart," Anna said, pulling her daughter close. "Bear and his friends are here to make sure we're safe." Through the window, Anna could see Bear standing in the center of their yard, his massive frame motionless as he watched the approaching riders. There was something different about his posture. Now gone was the gentle giant who told bedtime stories and carefully repaired broken things. In his place stood someone who looked like he'd been carved from Montana stone, implacable and dangerous. Morton Steele reined in his horse 20 yards from where Bear stood, just close enough to talk, but far enough away to avoid any sudden moves. His men spread out in a loose semicircle, hands resting near their weapons. "Mr. McCrae," Steele called out, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. "I hear you've been quite busy since our last conversation." "Mr. Steele," Bear replied calmly, "you're early. Most folks wait until after breakfast to come calling." Steele's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Circumstances have changed, I'm afraid. It seems Mrs. Hartwell has been to the territorial office in Helena, filed some very interesting papers." Bear showed no surprise, though Anna could see the tension in his shoulders. "Legal papers tend to be interesting to lawyers and such. Silver mining claims are interesting to a lot of people, McCrae. People with money, people with influence, people with the kind of resources that can make life very difficult for small-time farmers who get ideas above their station." One of Steele's men shifted nervously in his saddle, and Bear noted the movement without appearing to look directly at the rider. Years of military experience had taught him to track multiple threats simultaneously. "Mrs. Hartwell's got every right to file claims on her own land," Bear said evenly. "Her land?" Steele's voice rose slightly. "That's where you're wrong, McCrae. See, I've got documentation that shows Thomas Hartwell never actually completed the purchase of this property. Turns out there were some irregularities in the original deed transfer." Bear felt cold anger settle in his stomach. Legal manipulation was exactly the kind of tactic he'd expected from a man like Steele, but hearing it spoken aloud still made his hands clench into fists. "That's a lie." Anna's voice came from the cabin porch, where she'd stepped outside despite Bear's instructions to stay inside. Steele turned his attention to her with predatory interest. "Mrs. Hartwell, how lovely to see you again. I'm afraid you'll find that legal documents don't lie, even when the truth is inconvenient." "The deed is legal and recorded," Anna said firmly, though Bear could hear the fear underlying her defiance. "Was legal?" Steele corrected. "Until certain irregularities came to light. Amazing how these things happen. Paperwork gets misfiled, signatures get questioned, original documents disappear." Bear took a step forward, and several of Steele's men immediately tensed. "You're talking about fraud, Steele. That's a serious accusation to make without proof." "Oh, I have proof," Steele said smugly. "What I don't have is time to waste on lengthy legal proceedings, which is why I'm prepared to offer Mrs. Hartwell one final opportunity to accept my generous settlement offer." "And if she refuses?" Steele's smile was cold as winter ice. "Then I'm afraid the territorial authorities will be forced to evict illegal squatters from land that doesn't belong to them." And evictions can be unpleasant, especially when the squatters resist lawful orders. The threat was clear now, stripped of all pretense at legitimate business. Bear could see the calculation in Steele's eyes. He believed his superior numbers and corrupt legal maneuvering would be enough to force Anna's surrender. "How much?" Anna asked suddenly. Bear turned to look at her, surprised by the question. Anna stepped down from the porch, moving closer to where the two men faced each other. "How much are you offering?" Anna repeated. Steele's smile widened, sensing victory. $5,000, cash, more money than you've seen in your entire life. Anna nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering the offer. Bear watched her carefully, trying to understand what she was planning. "That's very generous," Anna said finally, "but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Steele's expression darkened. "That's a mistake, Mrs. Hartwell, a very expensive mistake." "Maybe," Anna agreed, "but it's my mistake to make." The standoff stretched taut between them, 8 armed men against one giant with a modified hammer and whatever help he might have hidden nearby. In the distance, the wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of violence. The tension snapped like an over-tightened wire when one of Steele's men made the mistake of reaching for his gun. Bear moved with the fluid speed of someone who'd survived more battles than most men could imagine, his modified hammer appearing in his hand as if by magic. The weighted tool caught the gunman's wrist with a crack that echoed across the valley, sending the weapon spinning harmlessly into the dirt. Before the man could recover, Bear had stepped inside his guard and delivered an elbow strike that dropped him from his saddle. "Nobody else needs to get hurt," Bear announced, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made even hardened men pause. But Steele's other riders were already drawing their weapons, and Bear found himself facing 7 guns, with nothing but his hammer and whatever help his neighbors could provide from their concealed positions. That's when Anna surprised everyone, including Bear. "Stop!" she shouted, stepping directly between Bear and the mounted gunman. "All of you, stop, right now." "Anna, get back," Bear started, but she cut him off. "Mr. Steele," Anna said, her voice carrying across the yard with startling clarity, "before your men do something that can't be undone, there's something you should know about those legal documents you're so proud of." Steele held up a hand, curious despite himself. "What are you talking about?" Anna reached into her coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a telegraph from the Territorial Governor's office. Seems they're very interested in mining companies that use fraudulent legal documents to steal land from citizens." Bear watched Steele's face change as the implications hit him. The man had clearly believed his corrupt connections would protect him, but territorial governors answered to Washington, and Washington didn't look kindly on companies that made the territory look lawless. "You're bluffing," Steele said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Anna unfolded the paper and began to read. "To Mrs. Anna Hartwell, regarding your complaint about fraudulent mining claims and illegal intimidation tactics. This office has launched a full investigation into Steele Mining Consortium and their business practices throughout the Montana Territory." The color drained from Steele's face as Anna continued reading. "Furthermore, any attempts to interfere with Mrs. Hartwell's lawful claim or to intimidate witnesses will be considered acts of criminal conspiracy against the territory." Bear felt a surge of admiration for Anna's strategic thinking. While he'd been preparing for a physical confrontation, she'd been building a legal fortress around their position. "That telegram is dated 3 days ago," one of Steele's men pointed out nervously, "before we even rode out here." Steele shot the man a venomous look, but the damage was done. His riders were beginning to understand that they might be participants in a federal crime rather than a simple business dispute. "There's more," Anna continued, her confidence growing as she saw the effect her words were having. "Seems the Territorial Marshal's office has been gathering testimony from other landowners who've had dealings with your company. Barn fires, poisoned livestock, mysterious accidents, all very interesting to federal investigators." "That's enough," Steele snarled, but his authority was crumbling as his men exchanged worried glances. Bear stepped closer to Anna, his hammer still ready but his posture slightly more relaxed. The restored cabin door behind them stood solid and secure, a symbol of everything they'd built together and everything they were fighting to protect. "I think your men are starting to understand the situation," Bear observed calmly. Federal charges carry serious penalties, prison time, not just fines. Two of Steele's riders were already backing their horses away from the confrontation, clearly wanting no part of whatever came next. The others looked uncertain, their loyalty to Steele wavering in the face of potential federal prosecution. "This isn't over," Steele said through gritted teeth, but his threat lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Anna replied firmly. "Your legal tricks won't work when the territorial authorities are watching. Your intimidation tactics won't work when federal marshals are investigating. And your hired guns won't work when good neighbors stand together." As if summoned by her words, 3 men emerged from concealed positions around the property, the neighboring ranchers who'd agreed to help defend the homestead. They weren't pointing weapons, but their presence made it clear that Bear and Anna weren't standing alone. 8 against 5 now, Bear noted conversationally, "and my friends know this land better than your men do." Steele looked around at his diminishing options, his face twisted with fury and frustration. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're dealing with. I have connections, resources." "Had," Anna corrected. "According to this telegram, several of your territorial connections are also under investigation. Amazing how corruption spreads once people start looking for it." The final blow came from an unexpected source. The sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of Marshal Davies and 2 federal deputies, their badges clearly visible as they rode purposefully toward the confrontation. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," Bear said with grim satisfaction. Steele's remaining men needed no further encouragement. They turned their horses and spurred them toward the ridge, abandoning their employer without a backward glance. Only Steele himself remained, his face pale with the realization that his schemes had finally collapsed around him. "This isn't over, McCrae," Steele said, his voice shaking with rage. "You think federal protection lasts forever? Think again." "Maybe not forever," Bear replied, stepping protectively closer to Anna, "but long enough for you to find yourself a new line of work." Marshal Davies and his deputies reached the yard just as Steele was preparing to flee. The territorial marshal was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier justice to recognize a defeated bully when he encountered one. "Mr. Steele," Davies called out pleasantly. "Perfect timing. I've got some questions I'd like to ask you about irregularities in mining claims throughout this district." Steele's face went ashen as he realized his legal manipulations had finally caught up with him. "I want to speak with my lawyer." "That's your right," Davies agreed. "Soon as we get back to town. Federal investigators are very interested in hearing about your recent business activities." As the marshal and his deputies escorted Steele away, Bear felt the last of his tension drain away. The immediate threat was over, but more importantly, Anna had proven herself to be far more formidable than any of them had imagined. "Federal telegram?" Bear asked quietly as they watched the riders disappear over the ridge. Anna smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in days. "Mrs. Patterson's nephew works in the territorial governor's office. Turns out bureaucrats don't like mining companies that make their territory look corrupt and lawless." Bear shook his head in amazement. "You've been planning this for days." "Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure the other side loses before it starts," Anna replied. "Thomas taught me that sometimes brains work better than brawn." As their neighbors approached to congratulate them and share in their relief, Bear realized that the battle for their home and future had been won not with violence, but with courage, community, and the kind of quiet intelligence that Anna had been demonstrating all along. The silver beneath their feet was still there, still valuable, still theirs to claim. But standing beside Anna as she accepted congratulations from their friends, Bear understood that the real treasure had been there all along, in the woman who'd taught him that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built with the people you chose to love. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that made the Montana Territory look like God's own garden, Bear McCrae stood in the same spot where he'd first begun repairing Anna's fence. but everything else had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The cabin behind him had been expanded and improved, with new windows that caught the morning light, and a wraparound porch where Jessie could play safely while Anna tended her greatly enlarged garden. The silver mine operated in partnership with 3 neighboring families and under careful territorial oversight provided more than enough income to transform the struggling homestead into one of the most prosperous farms in the district. But the changes that mattered most to Bear couldn't be measured in silver or surveyed with instruments. Anna emerged from the cabin wearing a dress of soft blue wool, her hair pinned up with the careful attention of a woman preparing for a special occasion. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of wild flowers that Jessie had gathered from the meadow beyond the creek. "Nervous?" Anna asked, joining Bear in the yard where Pastor Williams waited with his Bible and his gentle smile. "Some," Bear admitted, adjusting the collar of his best shirt. "Been a long time since I stood up in front of folks and made promises about the future." Anna reached out and straightened his tie with the casual intimacy that had grown between them over the winter months. "They're not promises to the future, Bear. They're promises to each other." The wedding ceremony was simple and beautiful, attended by the neighbors who'd become their extended family and the community members who'd watched their courtship bloom alongside Anna's garden. Jessie stood beside her mother as maid of honor, clutching her father's hand-carved wooden horse and beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking efforts had finally succeeded. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Bear kissed Anna with the gentle reverence of a man who'd learned to treasure second chances. The assembled crowd cheered, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang, as if celebrating along with them. The reception was held on the expanded porch, with music provided by neighbors who'd brought fiddles and guitars, and food prepared by every woman in 3 counties. Bear found himself surrounded by people who'd become more than friends. They'd become the family he'd never expected to have again. "Speech!" someone called out as the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and rose. Bear stood up reluctantly, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but understanding that some moments required acknowledgement. "I'm not much of a speaker," he began, his deep voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "But I reckon there are some things that need saying." He looked down at Anna, sitting beside him with Jessie on her lap, and felt his chest tighten with emotion. "6 months ago, I was a man who'd forgotten what it meant to have a home," Bear continued. "I'd been drifting for so long that I'd convinced myself it was what I wanted. Then I found a broken-down cabin with a leaking roof, and a little girl who believed in fixing things that seemed beyond repair." Jessie giggled and waved at him, and Bear felt his voice grow stronger. "Anna taught me that some things are worth fighting for. Jessie taught me that hope doesn't have an expiration date, and this community taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about people who choose to stand together when times get hard." The crowd murmured approval, and Bear saw several handkerchiefs being discreetly employed. "So I want to thank you all for welcoming a stranger, for standing with us when trouble came calling, and for proving that good people still outnumber the bad ones in this world." Bear reached into his vest pocket and withdrew his father's pocket watch, the same timepiece that had marked so many important moments in his life. "This watch belonged to my father, and his father before him," Bear said. "It's kept good time through wars and peace, through loss and joy. Tonight, I'm giving it to my daughter Jessie, so she'll always remember that time moves forward, but love endures." Jessie accepted the watch with the solemnity of someone who understood she was receiving something precious. "Thank you, Papa Bear," she whispered, and the words hit Bear like a physical blow to the heart. As the evening wound down and guests began to take their leave, Bear and Anna found themselves alone on the porch, watching the last of the sunset fade into star-filled darkness. "Any regrets?" Anna asked, leaning against his shoulder with the contentment of someone who'd finally found her place in the world. Bear considered the question seriously. "Only one," he said finally. Anna looked up at him with concern. "What's that?" I regret that it took me so long to find my way here, Bear said. 23 years is a long time to spend running from happiness. Anna smiled and kissed his cheek. You arrived exactly when we needed you most. I think that's what matters. Inside the cabin, they could hear Jessie singing softly to herself as she got ready for bed. The sound was sweet and peaceful, the sound of a child who felt safe and loved and secure in her world. On Anna's finger, a wedding ring forged from silver, taken from their own land, caught the starlight. It was simple and beautiful, like the life they'd built together from broken pieces and stubborn hope. What are you thinking about? Anna asked, noting Bear's contemplative silence. Bear looked around at the property they'd defended together, at the cabin they'd restored with their own hands, at the future they'd built from nothing more than faith and hard work. I'm thinking about how sometimes the best things in life come disguised as work that needs doing, Bear said. How a man can spend years looking for his purpose, only to find it in the simple act of fixing what's broken. Anna nestled closer to him, and Bear wrapped his arm around her shoulders. And what's your purpose now? Bear smiled, feeling more at peace than he had in decades. To keep building, to keep fixing, to keep choosing love over fear, every single day. Above them, the Montana sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars and possibilities. And on the porch of their restored cabin, a gentle giant, and the woman who'd taught him to believe in tomorrow again, sat planning the rest of their lives together, while their daughter slept safely inside the home they'd all helped to build.